Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic that they've delved into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Cynthia, and today I'm here with Professor Campero, and we're going to talk about their research regarding referral networks, which is pretty fascinating. But to tell you a little bit more about Santiago, he's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. His work focuses on labor market inequality and organizational dynamics, with a particular interest in the high-tech startup sector. His research explores how factors like social networks, status, and reputation shape opportunities for job seekers, especially in industries where certain groups are underrepresented. Before joining U of T, Santiago taught at HEC Montréal and worked as a management consultant at McKinsey Company. He holds a bachelor's in engineering, a master's from UC Berkeley, and a PhD in management from MIT. Today, he's here to share some valuable insights about network referrals and self-presentation, and how those impact the hiring process in the high-tech labor market. And without further ado, Santiago, welcome to Curious Campus.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a really interesting topic we have on the table today, network referrals. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I do want to ask, how did you first become interested in this field of study, this idea of like the intersection of the labor market and what impacts it?
Yeah, well, I think it was through my own personal experience. So I'm originally from Mexico, and I immigrated to the U.S. in my 20s. And while I was in the U.S., I was looking for work, and the experience of, I guess, struggling in the labor market, right? And not figuring out what employers expect, how to increase your chances, how to do better as a job seeker was just something that I found really fascinating. And I think in terms of networks specifically, I think one of the things that happens often when people immigrate to a new country is that they lose their social capital, right? Or they lose their networks, the people they grew up with, the people that they knew growing up, who often are the people that you rely on to help you get a job and help you move ahead in the labor market. So when you immigrate, you kind of lose that, right? Because you're in a new country, you don't have the same networks that you did in your country of origin. So that contrast that I experienced made me very curious, right? About why are networks so important? Why do people rely so much on networks when they're looking for work? And I would say lastly, the part about the high-tech industry, I think I was also drawn to that also through my background as an immigrant, because in the US, a lot of the employers that I was approaching when I was looking for work, they didn't sponsor your visa, right? So that was kind of a big thing back then. And the tech industry was kind of one of the bright spots for immigrants or for people who were needing kind of visa sponsorship. So it always kind of came across as kind of an industry that had its doors a little bit more open to newcomers than other industries. So that's kind of the image that I had, but then the experience of actually looking for work in that industry was not as easy as I expected. So I got very curious about this particular industry in terms of, how open is it? What does it take for someone to get a job in this industry to break in? So it was a little bit through that experience.
Yeah, it's a burning question that a lot of students even now have trying to break into the industry. But being able to explore this kind of curiosity, what would you say was the most rewarding aspect of kind of delving into this research?
Yeah, I mean, I think as researchers, it's a very kind of long and arduous process. So, I started looking into this when I was doing my dissertation, which now is more than 10 years ago, right? So I started really delving into this particular topic around 2012. And I came across some data on job applicants to different firms in the high-tech industry. And so I was looking at some of the resumes that job seekers were presenting to these different employers. And I was noticing like some kind of subtle differences, like when I compared somebody's resume that they submitted to one employer versus another, right? Like maybe they would talk about their prior jobs in a slightly different way, use different terminology to describe their experience and so on. And initially, I didn't think much of it, right? Because it wasn't that common to find these kind of subtle differences. So I thought it was just maybe people were correcting errors, maybe in a prior version of their resume or something like that, right? Something more innocuous. So for a long time, I just didn't pay much attention to these kind of small differences in different resumes. But then the thought occurred to me that, maybe this is not just noise, right? Maybe these are not just kind of random errors that people are correcting. Maybe there's something systematic, right, about these kind of small changes in people's resumes. And so I started analyzing these kind of different ways in which people presented their experience more systematically. And I found that it wasn't random, right? That actually people were making these changes to fit the job that they were pursuing, right? To make their experience sound more similar. And I think that was what was most rewarding, right? Just the fact that when you look at something for a long time, you can realize that even things that initially look to you as noise, right, or just randomness, can have something hidden there that's kind of systematic and interesting. So yeah,
it's like the moment of realizing that there's like a pattern emerging from the chaos almost. That's really fascinating. And this idea of looking at these resumes, seeing the differences between how people are presenting themselves, you could say, it kind of leads me into my next big question, because in your recent research about network referrals, self-presentation, these are the two main concepts you're focusing on. But would you mind elaborating on how you would define these two ideas, and also how are they relevant in this context?
Yeah. The idea of self-presentation is simply the fact that we're kind of complex, multifaceted as human beings, right? Like we have different aspects of our personalities, different aspects of our experience, things we've done in the past. And so when we approach someone, and especially when we approach a company where we're trying to get a job, we need to figure out how to present ourselves, right? We need to figure out what aspects of our background are relevant, what should we highlight versus not, how should we talk about things. And I think this is something that just really fascinated me because, I always kind of assume that, your background is just your background, right? And you just lay it out without much thought. But the more I thought about it, this idea of self-presentation and the complexity of it, right? Like figuring out how to present yourself in different contexts, I think is really interesting. And I feel like we're only scratching the surface of how many things go into that. So that's kind of the self-presentation piece. In terms of the referral piece, I guess my interest in that is just coming from the fact that most people find their jobs through some kind of network connection or some kind of referral. And so it seemed to me kind of important to bring those two ideas together, right? Like on the one hand, how do you figure out how to present yourself? And then on the other hand, what role do networks play in that, right? Like the people the people you come into contact with, and so on.
Yeah, it's definitely a machine with many working parts. And I think a lot of times as people who are aspiring to enter the job market, so many of my peers in computer science are always talking about, can I get a referral to here? Can you look at my resume? Can you roast my resume? But reading your paper, there was a lot of additional complexity that emerged that I didn't really think about, especially this idea of referral networks impacting self-presentation and how those two link together rather than being separate entities. Would you mind talking more about that idea?
Yeah. So I guess it's not novel to say that networks matter in the labor market. I mean, I think that's very well documented, right? That people rely a lot on networks to find jobs, and that companies, maybe not always, but very often prioritize candidates that have some kind of social connection to somebody at the firm. But a lot of that research really has focused on a couple ways in which networks help, right? So one way is just in transmitting information about jobs, right? So, you might not hear about a job unless you know somebody at the company, or if you know somebody at the company, you might hear about the job earlier than somebody else. So that's kind of well documented. It's also well documented that having a network connection to an employer might also help you kind of in the selection process, right? Because that person might put in a good word for you, or maybe tell the hiring manager about how they know you, how great you are, and so on, right? So that's also kind of well documented, right? That networks kind of influence the employer side. But I was kind of interested in thinking about, well, do networks maybe also influence the job seeker, right? And how the job seeker goes about approaching a firm. And so that was where I thought, well, let's look at this self-presentation piece and kind of try to understand how having a network connection might help that side of things, right? Like kind of the job seeker and how they go about approaching the employer.
And how are some of the ways that it impacts the job seeker's way of approaching the firm? Like, what do they change about themselves or their presentation now that they have this sort of in with a network referral?
Yeah, so I think primarily what I document is that they do it in a couple of ways. One is just to motivate the job seeker to put in more effort, right? To kind of tailoring their resume and presenting something that's very polished. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you have a connection to the firm, first of all, you probably assume that your chances of getting the job are higher, right? So you might be more motivated to put your best foot forward. And also you might worry about not making the person who's referring you look bad, right? So you don't want to kind of make your contact who's helping you out kind of look bad by referring you. So you might also kind of invest more in presenting yourself in a very polished way for that reason. So that's kind of one part, motivation. But the contact can also help you have kind of more information, kind of inside information about what the firm is really looking for, right? Because otherwise, what can you go on to kind of figure out what the firm is really looking for? You can kind of look at the job posting, but a lot of job postings are very generic. So if you have a contact, they might tell you, this is what the job is in general, but turns out because of where the company is at the moment, we're really looking for this type of skill, right? Or we're really looking for, somebody with this type of background, right? So that can be kind of very helpful inside information. And then the last way I think that networks play a role, and I wasn't able to delve into this as much in the paper, but I think is really important, is kind of the whole ethics, right, around self-presentation, because it's really a very tricky area to navigate, right? Because anytime you are kind of adjusting things about your background, how you present yourself, it's a very gray area ethically, right? So it's kind of the norm, and people expect you to, maybe tweak certain things about your background, how you present yourself to appeal to the company that you're approaching. But there's always the risk of crossing a line into outright fabricating things, right? Fabricating experience or whatever. And that is something that, obviously for ethical reasons you don't want to do, but also for instrumental reasons, right? So as I was doing this research, I was kind of delving into this topic of resume fraud, right? More generally. And, what I was finding is stories of people who got to very senior levels in organizations, positions of a lot of responsibility, and somebody discovered that 30 years earlier when they applied for a job, they had fabricated something about their background, their experience, and they've ended up being fired, having to resign. So the career consequences of being caught doing that are pretty severe and pretty long lasting, right? So I think referrals or having a connection at a company, or maybe more generally having trusted others that you can talk about these things with, I think also help job seekers kind of stay on the right side of that ethical boundary, right? Because whenever you're kind of navigating these type of ethical ambiguities, it's helpful to have other people that you can talk about, right? Like, about these issues with, right? You can ask, like, can I maybe rephrase this job title that I had a little bit? Is that still consistent with the truth, or am I kind of crossing an ethical boundary? So there's research that when people are navigating these ethical gray areas, they rely a lot on kind of people they trust, right? To kind of get feedback, ask their opinion, and so on.
Like to put almost like a social pressure on them to not overly inflate the truth, maybe, or to also give an additional perspective on how maybe skilled they are or how much experience they actually have in certain fields.
Yeah, exactly, right? So again, whenever somebody's recommending you for a position or something like that, you are kind of accountable to that person, right? Perhaps that makes you more accountable, feel more of a sense of responsibility than when you're approaching a company where you don't know it. So I think from an ethical standpoint, to your point, it also makes people perhaps less inclined, right, to cross those boundaries when they have, somebody else's reputation at stake, right?
Nowadays, some scrolling on social media or on the internet, you see like bits of modern advice on resumes and some jokes about, oh, when they ask me to use the one language I wrote on my resume, and when I apply, but I don't actually know how to speak. So there's like some humor and some, as you said, like an expectation almost to maybe pretty up the truth or inflate the truth.
Right.
And it kind of does seem close to unethical, but I guess there's an air of like, if everyone's participating in like this little bit of unethicalness, then that's more ethical.
Right.
So in this kind of atmosphere, how do people navigate that, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very challenging, right? And I think the first thing is just to recognize that it's really a gray area, right? And like a lot of ethical dilemmas are, right? It's often not black and white, right? There's a lot of gray area. And so I think that's the first thing, right? Just to recognize that. And then again, right, I think there's a process of like socialization into these norms around self-presentation and kind of how you adapt, how you present yourself. And so being kind of immersed in a particular community that has certain norms around this is, I think, how people learn this, right? But, but people do transgress, right? So one of the limitations of this research was that I don't have any way to verify the objective truth, right? So I have versions of people's resumes that they present to different companies. And so I can compare that when there are inconsistencies in itself meaningful. But the reason I wasn't able to delve into these ethical issues more in depth is that, like I said, I don't know the objective truth. So when there's two different versions of a resume, I don't know if one is really like the truth and then the other one is more embellished, or maybe they're both embellished in different ways. Or so that was a little bit the limitation that I had in looking at this more deeply.
Yeah. Were there other limitations you found trying to conduct your study, like areas where you ran into a wall, so to speak, and you had to find a way to get around it?
So I think, I mean, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a limitation, but part of the data I was relying on only had kind of the basic skeletons of resumes, just like job titles and employers and dates, right? But there's a lot more in a resume, right? Like in a resume, people usually will describe their background and experience like in a few bullet points for each position. People will also write cover letters, right, where they kind of summarize their background and so on. So I didn't have that data, right? I wish I did. If I had, I think I would have probably been able to uncover a lot more nuance and richness about, how people go about presenting themselves. But because I had just kind of the bare bones basics, it was a little bit limited. But kind of the flip side of that is that the inconsistencies that I found are probably a pretty conservative, I guess, test or estimate of how much people kind of tailor and adapt their background, right? Because I was looking at basically the most objective, verifiable pieces of a resume, like titles and employers. So if you looked at the more descriptive parts, probably there's a lot more kind of tailoring, adaptation that goes on.
Yeah, definitely. So given that your data set, I'd be interested to know if you conducted this research again, but with a more, I guess, full database of resumes with, more details in it, like more little notes? Because I do imagine like when you had the opportunity to like describe like what exactly you did in the job, that's where you kind of push and pull the truth a little bit more.
Right.
Do you think you would find anything new? Like, do you anticipate it would just be maybe a confirmation of what you already know, or do you think there could be some more details and like interesting ideas that could be extracted from that information?
My hunch is that I would find kind of the same pattern in that, probably people who have network ties are going to do more tailoring in those parts of the resume too. But in a way, I'm not sure how impactful that is, because I think some of the research on like how much time employers spend looking at a resume suggests that it's very little. I think 40 seconds to a minute, right? So these kind of more detailed descriptions, at least in the initial screening, I'm not sure how much difference they make on the employer side.
That makes sense. Though, kind of in exploring the idea of like what makes sense, a lot of the results sound, maybe if they're not intuitive, at least not surprising, I suppose, to the average listener. But was there anything that was surprising or like unanticipated for you as a result of your study?
Yeah, I think this part about people kind of tweaking their job titles, taking out words in their employers, right? So again, there's a lot of immigrants, right, in the high-tech industry. And people would take out, if they worked in a big company, big multinational company, they would take out the part that said where exactly they worked for this company, right? So they would take out, Microsoft India, right? And leave just Microsoft, this kind of thing, right? And that makes sense if you are kind of in the know and socialized into the industry. You would know that employers would probably be less inclined to interview you if they know that your experience is abroad, as opposed to if you leave it more ambiguous, right? If you leave it ambiguous, you're less likely to get penalized for having foreign experience, right? So again, right, going back to the part about the detailed descriptions, we would expect people to tailor those detailed descriptions, to tailor their cover letters. But the fact that people were also kind of tweaking, the names of employers or their prior job titles was something that surprised me, right? And that, as we discussed before, raises ethical questions, right, as well, right? I mean, I think, one of the things that I'm thinking about now is kind of what's the impact of AI on all this, right?
Oh, yes.
Because I guess this data that I'm using is a little bit old, right? It's like from 2010 or so. And, back then we didn't have as widespread use of AI as we do now. So then, back then probably it would take more effort, right, for somebody to tailor their resume and, write a cover letter and so on. So I'm very curious of how these dynamics might look now, right? Because now you can ask ChatGPT or whatever to like tailor your resume, to a job description. And so given that is becoming way easier now, I'm very curious, right, to see how those dynamics would play out these days.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I almost hear in terms of AI, from the opposite end, the concerns. Because most of who I hear from are, people who are looking for jobs in computer science. So there's like a certain air of familiarity with this idea of like generative AI and its usage. But what I hear most commonly is this idea of recruiters using generative AI to scan my resume for keywords. So if I don't have this specific word or like these combinations, or I should just throw as many buzzwords into my resume as I can so that it gets picked up by whatever tool they're using.
Right.
But at the same time, some companies that I've had the opportunity to speak to some of their reps at whatever events, they sort of insist that no, we go through it by hand still.
Right.
And whether there's any truth to that is like I can't verify.
Yes.
But there's a new kind of, I guess, atmosphere and like idea of how we need to cultivate ourselves. Almost like people are thinking about how can I present myself not just to a person but to to the AI. Like,
Right,
how do I
right.
present myself best to this automated machine?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in either case, right, whether it's a human that is screening the resume or an algorithm, my general advice based on my research is just within ethical boundaries, make your resume look as similar to the job as you can, right? Like, that's kind of what my research shows, right? That the more your background matches the position, the more likely it is that the employer will interview you. And I'm assuming it would be the same if it's an AI screening the resume. I think the question I have in terms of AI is kind of more the role of networks, right? Because I'm wondering, is the advent of AI going to make networks less or more important? And I think there's plausible arguments on both sides, right? Because, on the one hand, you could say to yourself, AI is going to level the playing field a little bit, right? Because maybe back in 2010, it made more of a difference if you had a contact, right, that could coach you on preparing your resume or whatever. But now, right, you can just have AI help you prepare a very polished resume. So it might kind of mitigate the effect of networks in a way. But I think you can also make the opposite argument, which is that now that AI is so prevalent and easy to use, employers are going to see all resumes that are super polished and super tailored. It all looks great. And so they won't be able to distinguish anymore just by looking at the resume, like, does this person really fit as much, right? Because there'll be less difference in terms of how people present themselves. And so if that's the case, if the resume becomes less informative because it's being co-produced with AI, then maybe people are going to rely even more on networks, right? The employers, because they're going to say, all of my candidates look really similar, right? Because they're all using AI to prepare their resume. So I can't choose just by looking at a resume, right? So I'm going to look for kind of softer factors that maybe I'm going to get through, or somebody having a referral, right? And me being able to ask somebody that I know, like, who really is this person, right? Like, are they really skilled at these things that they've put on their resume and so on? So I think it can go both ways. And I think it's a really interesting research question these days.
Like this idea of if we're all more similar, if we're all on the same playing field, in one hand, it's more fair, but also it means that there's more, if you're unique, you stand out even more. Or if you have a different advantage, then you're even more advantaged in comparison.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's you can think about what employers take into account as consisting of the paper profile of a candidate and then other signals that they might get that are not on the paper, right? And so if the paper part of different candidates becomes more similar, right, because it's being produced by AI, then the other part becomes kind of more significant, right?
Oh, I see. That makes sense.
That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. And I know that your research mostly focused on, as briefly mentioned before, the high-tech labor market, especially in America. Do you think you would find differing results if you maybe took this study to a different part of the world, or even just a different industry entirely? Or do you think these impacts potentially just resonate throughout the entire labor market?
I mean, it's a good question, right? And it goes back to why I was interested in high tech to begin with, right? Because I kind of had this image, right, that high tech is more open as an industry in the sense that they recruit a lot of immigrants. Maybe they have more of a focus on hard skills, technical skills that are more objectively verifiable. I think the truth of it is that maybe not as open as people think. But I still think that if you were to look at other industries that people have done similar studies on, like investment banking or consulting or these type of kind of elite professional services, I think, the effect of networks and self-presentation I think it would play an even bigger role, is my guess.
Makes sense. It's definitely something that is, I guess, its impact is felt no matter where you're working, how you're working, who you're talking to. There's always going to be someone, likely most of us at some point in our lives have had to like give a resume to someone and like hope for the best. And I wanted to ask, what do you hope that this study will ultimately contribute to both the academic community and to the broader public?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the community, in terms of helping people understand how the labor market works and really highlighting the importance of networking, right? Which you might say is not new, right? For a long time, know that networking is really important to getting a job. But I think this research kind of underscores that and kind of shows a new way in which networks are influential, right? So it's not just that networks help you find out about jobs or help you have a better chance of being hired because of the person who's recommending you maybe putting in a good word for you, but it also influences you, right? It also influences how you are going to behave, maybe how motivated you're going to feel, or how capable of, I guess, approaching the employer in the right way you're going to be. So I think that's what I hope can contribute to people looking for work. And I think for society or for employers more broadly, I think it's important for, I guess, us collectively to think more about the big role that networks play in the labor market, because networks are not random, right? Like, connections are not random. And, having connections with firms that have high paying jobs is correlated with people's class background, immigrant status, race, things along those lines. So if we want to make the labor market more equitable, we need to think about the big role that networks play in it, right? And I guess more concrete things that people could take away from this are, for instance, given that networks have such a big influence, are there ways that we can kind of create connections to people that are maybe disadvantaged, right? So this could be through like mentoring programs, things like that, right? Like where people in the industry get connected with maybe students or kind of young people who might lack access or connection to the industry, right? So trying to find ways to create these connections rather than just relying on connections that maybe people inherit from their family, from where they went to school or whatever, I think is one way of maybe making the benefits of networks accessible more broadly.
And as a bit of a final question to round it off, from your experience as someone who was at once an immigrant in a country who maybe didn't have as many network connections as others who were born and raised in that country, what advice would you have for people in that same situation who are new somewhere, maybe far from home, and are trying to, I guess, find that job and make those connections?
I think the first thing is to kind of figure out what you want, right? Like what you're really passionate about, because looking for work is hard, right? And is very discouraging and can take a long time. So it's important to feel like you're motivated by something that you're really passionate about, right? Or that you're really drawn to. That's both important for your own motivation, but also how you're going to come across to others, right? Because I think people pick up on that. And, in terms of networking, I think it's not easy to form those connections, but I think to the extent that you can, try not to be instrumental about it, right? Where, sometimes like, I hate to like pick on students, but for instance, when students like want a letter of recommendation, right? Like, I'll have a student that maybe didn't come to class very frequently, I didn't get to know well, or, didn't do particularly well in my class. And then out of nowhere, they reach out and they're like, oh, I'm applying to grad school. Like, will you write me a letter of recommendation? So I think about that as kind of exemplifying a little bit, people who are, learning how to network and figuring out how to do that. And so, when you approach people with like, asking for something very concrete, where you haven't really built a relationship, I think sometimes it's not the most effective way. So I think of networking in terms of this idea of like pre-gifting, right? Because, networks are like based on reciprocity, right? Kind of doing things for others and other people, helping you out. And so I think not the most effective way to network, an effective way to network is pre-gifting, meaning like being helpful, doing favors for people around you, like supporting other people around you. And that's going to build your social capital, right? When it comes time for you to need something for others, like a referral or something like that, you're going to have that social capital and people are going to be more willing to help you because, you've kind of built that relationship, you're contributed to your community, and then that kind of comes back to you later.
Yeah. That's really fantastic advice. And I think that's advice that I would have loved to hear when I was first starting out as well. So thank you so much for sharing. And thank you so much for coming on the
it's my pleasure.
podcast with us. And this concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Santiago. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look into his research, especially his paper on network referrals and self-presentations in the high-tech labor market. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.